The wind that brushes the Tanzanian coast carries more than salt and sand. It carries memory. Not the kind etched into books or sung in songs, but something deeper, buried beneath coral stone mosques and centuries of silence. It pulses quietly in the bones of the ancestors. DNA. Unseen, unheard until now. For years, the stories were just that, stories. Tales passed down from elders along the Swahili Coast, whispering of Persian princes arriving on wooden dhows, marrying local women, building cities of stone and faith. Historians debated their truth. Archaeologists searched for proof. And then the bones began to speak. It began with 80 skeletal remains, pulled from the earth in ancient cities like Kilwa-Kisawani, Songo-Nara, and Twapa. They had no names, no visible scars of empire or conquest, but in their marrow lay the unmistakable echo of a forgotten origin. When scientists at Harvard and Rice sequenced their DNA, the results shattered the silence, and every old assumption with it. These people were not purely African. They were not fully Persian either. Their blood was a testament to something more powerful than war or trade. It was a legacy of intimacy, of connection. The women, African in lineage and life, passed down their mitochondrial DNA, unbroken and proudly Bantu. The men, travelers from Persia, India, and later Arabia, left their mark through the Y chromosome. But their children? Their children were Swahili. This wasn't conquest. It wasn't colonization. It was fusion, deliberate, enduring, and human. Around the year 1000 CE, on this very soil, African women and foreign men began forming families. Not out of force, but out of alignment, economic, cultural, spiritual. They lived in towns built by African hands, spoke Swahili, a Bantu tongue shaped by the ocean's trade winds, and worshipped under crescent moons carved into coral walls. For centuries, Western historians painted these people as foreigners, as if greatness on African shores must have arrived from across the sea. In response, African scholars reclaimed the narrative, insisting on indigenous genius. But now, the DNA reveals the truth is neither extreme. The truth is richer. The truth is Tanzanian. Because here, ancestry doesn't follow clean lines. It weaves. It braids. It holds contradictions and celebrates them. Tanzanian DNA isn't unique because it is mixed. It's unique because it remembers every thread. From the inland forests to the salt-sprayed coastlines, from African foremothers to Persian forefathers, from forgotten graves to global journals, the story has waited, not to be rewritten, but to be listened to, finally, as it was lived. And this is only the beginning. Beneath the soft hum of monsoon winds, the Swahili Coast stood as a gateway, not just for goods, but for people, languages, and lifelines. Across the vast Indian Ocean, sails billowed from distant shores. They weren't invaders. They weren't just merchants. They were messengers of change, and they brought more than gold or incense. They brought genes. Long before European ships arrived, long before maps carved Africa into someone else's image, Persian traders were anchoring off these shores. They waited for the monsoon to turn, but something more profound kept them here. Not profit, but permanence. In the alleys of Kilwa, in the moonlit courtyards of Songo-Nara, they built homes. They built legacies. And they built families with local women whose ancestors had walked that land for millennia. Modern science caught up centuries later. When researchers traced the genetic code of those buried in Swahili towns between 1250 and 1800 CE, they uncovered a rhythm, a pattern not seen anywhere else. It wasn't a random scatter of ancestry. It was a precise blend. African mitochondrial DNA inherited from mothers, and Persian, Indian, or Arabian Y chromosomes from fathers. This was not sporadic. This was structural. Each generation layered upon the next, deepening the blend. In cities like Ntwapa, DNA revealed that almost half of their genome came from Asia, and yet their identities, their rituals, their language, remained grounded in African soil. This wasn't a fading heritage. It was a rising hybrid. Islam spread through these connections, but it didn't erase what came before. Coral mosques rose beside ancestral shrines. Arabic inscriptions etched into tombs didn't replace African belief systems. They fused with them. The foreign was not imposed. It was invited, then indigenized. What's even more compelling is how distinct every region was. Makwesini, an inland town, showed no foreign genetic presence at all. Its DNA echoed purely African ancestry, proving that the coastal intermingling wasn't uniform. It was specific, intentional, shaped by geography and purpose. The story shifted again by 1500 CE. Persian influence began to wane. Arabian DNA crept in, reflecting the new dominance of Omani control. But still, the African maternal lines held steady. Generation after generation, it was African women who carried culture forward, who made this civilization their own. And while Persian ancestry may have arrived in ships, it was African memory that anchored it to land. Each town, from Lamu to Kilwa, sang its own version of this genetic ballad. Some leaned more Indian, others more Persian. But the harmony was unmistakable. Tanzania wasn't a melting pot. It was a mosaic, deliberate, sacred, precise. This is not the story of genes diluted. This is the story of legacies compounded. Deep inside the cells of Swahili ancestors, a code lies coiled like a forgotten melody, silent, complex, and thousands of years old. But it doesn't speak in full sentences. It hums in patterns. It whispers in alleles. And when scientists finally listened, it didn't tell a simple tale of roots. It revealed a symphony of ancestry, layered and alive. At the heart of this genetic revelation lies one of nature's most powerful storytellers, mitochondrial DNA. It passes exclusively from mother to child, undisturbed by paternal input. In Tanzania's medieval coast, nearly every ancient skeleton yielded the same verdict: a maternal line deeply and unmistakably African, unbroken, uninterrupted, undeniable. But the paternal story? That unfolds in a different tongue. Y chromosomes traced through the male line painted a map stretching beyond the continent, to Shiraz in Persia, to Gujarat in India, to the southern ports of Arabia. These weren't vague traces. In many individuals, Asian ancestry accounted for nearly half of their entire genome, an astonishing signal from across the ocean. And yet, it wasn't chaos. The data aligned. It told of a society where African women bore children with foreign men, not in isolated cases, but across generations, across regions, across dynasties. The findings weren't just genetically rich. They were mathematically elegant. When mapped using principal component analysis, Swahili individuals from Twapa and Faza formed a genetic line, a smooth gradient between inland African and Asian source populations. It wasn't random mixing. It was evidence of two lineages deliberately intertwining. Further modeling revealed something even more astonishing. Those Asian fathers weren't pure either. They carried their own blend, mostly Persian, but tinged with Indian ancestry, already fused before they reached African shores. Which means the Swahili mosaic didn't just form at the point of contact. It began long before, in ports far across the sea, in cities that no longer exist, in families that left no name, but did leave genes. Scientists used QPADM models, a statistical tool to estimate ancestry, and discovered that the northern Swahili coast, including Twapa and Manda, was best explained not by a simple two-way mix, but by three distinct sources: African, Persian, and Indian. Meanwhile, towns further south, like Kilwa, leaned toward a simpler African-Persian blend, reflecting a different migratory footprint. And while each town had its own ratio, its own historical fingerprint, a pattern emerged. The African ancestry remained rooted through the maternal line, while foreign ancestry fluctuated through shifting male lineages. The sex bias in this genetic exchange wasn't subtle. It was absolute. Out of 62 individuals with readable mitochondrial DNA, nearly all belonged to haplogroups native to Africa. But the Y chromosomes told a different story. In Manda, for instance, none of the men carried African Y markers. In Twapa, just a handful did. The rest bore signatures from across the seas, haplogroups like J2 and G2, common in Southwest Asia but rare in Sub-Saharan Africa. It wasn't conquest. It was cultural entanglement, forged in trade, in trust, in time. Each generation of Swahili townspeople wasn't replacing the last. They were layering atop them, African mothers nurturing children who would inherit the world, one allele at a time. No other region offers this level of clarity, A genetic narrative so perfectly balanced between science and story, between statistic and soul. In every way that can be measured, Tanzania's medieval coast stood not just as a link between continents, but as a living laboratory of human connection. And the further scientists dug into the data, the louder the DNA seemed to speak. In every Swahili household, there's a name that carries no tombstone, a face that survives only in stories told at dusk. These aren't fairy tales. They're fragments of memory, memory so persistent it resisted history books that tried to overwrite it. For generations, the elders whispered of foreign blood, of ancestors who arrived by sea, of Persian fathers and African mothers. It wasn't a claim to superiority. It was a song of survival, a way of remembering who they were when the world forgot. But for decades, scholars dismissed it, called it myth-making, said the Swahili were trying to embellish their past, dressing up in borrowed robes from Arabia and Iran. Even as they lived in coral-built towns, spoke a language layered in African roots, and practiced customs older than any map, they were told, "This doesn't belong to you." And now, science has walked into the room, sat down beside the elders, and said, "You were right." Because when DNA from medieval burials confirmed Persian and Indian male ancestry woven tightly into African maternal lines, it wasn't just data, it was vindication. Oral traditions weren't embellishment. They were evidence. They had been carrying the truth all along, in story, in blood, in silence. This isn't just about who married whom. It's about how identity was crafted, not in laboratories, but in the choices of women who dared to embrace the foreign without losing the familiar. Women who gave birth not just to children, but to a new civilization. Every coral house, every carved door, every word of Kiswahili that rolls off the tongue carries their echo. And yet, not all the stories were peaceful. Turn inland, to the hills of Kilimanjaro. There lies another strand of Tanzanian DNA, one not celebrated in textbooks, but mourned in silence. In 1900, German colonial forces publicly executed 19 Chaga and Meru leaders. Their skulls were shipped to Europe, not for burial, but for measurement, for racial science, for cruelty disguised as curiosity. A century passed, and then DNA did what no government had done. It identified the remains. Mangi Malilia, Akita Sindado Kutesha. Men whose names had lived only in grief now returned, molecule by molecule, to their descendants. The Marajesho Project didn't just match skulls to saliva. It restored ancestors to families. It turned statistics into homecomings. That's the power of DNA in Tanzania. It doesn't just reveal migration. It heals rupture. It stitches together what was torn apart, not just by time, but by empire. And this duality of creation and reclamation is what makes Tanzanian DNA unlike any other. It is the blueprint of a people who blended by choice and endured by force. It carries the joy of cultural union and the scars of colonial theft, often in the same strand. It's more than ancestry. It's defiance, written in genes. As the sun lowers over the Indian Ocean, it paints the Tanzanian coast in amber and gold, not knowing that beneath these waters, beneath this soil, lies the genetic fingerprint of one of the world's most quietly complex civilizations. Swahili towns once shimmered with trade, language, and faith, but they shimmered, too, with something invisible. A lineage so intricate, it took a millennium and modern science to finally see it clearly. And now that we do, the question lingers like smoke over Zanzibar's rooftops. What does it really mean to belong? Because Tanzanian DNA doesn't offer a neat origin story. It doesn't trace a straight line. It arcs, bends, coils around centuries of union, migration, rupture, and resilience. It's not one story. It's a collection of decisions, made in silence, in trust, in survival. What makes it unique isn't that it mixes African and Asian ancestry. Many places do. What makes it extraordinary is how that mix became its own identity. Not a dilution, but a definition. These weren't people losing culture. These were people writing a new one, in a language shaped by the waves, in a faith held steady by stone mosques, in traditions carried by women who taught their children how to remember, even when history refused to. DNA can be clinical, cold, a data point. But here in Tanzania, it feels like a second heartbeat, one that pulses through time, refusing to be forgotten. And now, as we map those ancient genomes onto modern lives, we begin to understand this isn't just science. It's a reunion, a reckoning, a restoration of truths that lived in silence too long. The people of the Swahili Coast never needed permission to be extraordinary. Now they have proof. So the next time someone speaks of Tanzania, think beyond borders. Think of a child born in 1100 CE, whose mother knew the rhythm of African soil and whose father carried the wind of Shiraz in his hair. Think of the grandmother who taught Kiswahili under a carved archway while spices boiled and Arabic calligraphy dried on coral walls. Think of DNA as a storybook and Tanzania as its most poetic chapter. Because in a world obsessed with bloodlines and boxes, Tanzanian DNA dares to say, we are more than where we came from. We are what we became, together. What about you? What does your DNA say about you that history forgot? Tell us your story. Drop your thoughts in the comments. Like the video if it moved you. Share it, not for the algorithm, but for the ancestors. And remember, the past isn't gone. It's just waiting to be read. Some legacies are carved in stone. Others are whispered through generations. But the deepest ones flow silently through blood. Tanzania's coastline has always been more than geography. It's been a witness to arrivals, to departures, to the formation of a civilization whose very existence defies simplistic definition. Yet no empire ever truly wrote its story. The people did. Through memory, through custom, and now through chromosomes. The bones unearthed in Kilwa or Sangonara don't speak. But what they carry, deep inside their molecular blueprint, is a record of survival, a record of union, a record of transformation. In a single strand of DNA from a medieval Tanzanian woman, you might find the echo of generations who fished these waters, tended inland farms, and welcomed strangers with languages they'd never heard. In that same strand, you may also glimpse the residue of a foreign lineage, Persian, Indian, Arabian, woven so seamlessly into her descendants that it no longer feels foreign at all. This is not accidental. It's architectural. What Tanzania holds isn't just mixed ancestry. It holds an engineered harmony, not through conquest or collapse, but through centuries of quiet integration. Each child born along the Swahili Coast carried a message, passed down in the language of proteins and base pairs. We are many histories made one. Even the language, Kiswahili, carries this genetic truth. A Bantu foundation, yes, but touched by the syntax of traders, the vocabulary of pilgrims, and the rhythm of sailors who came, stayed, and became. Religion was adopted, but never imposed. Structures changed, but identities didn't dissolve. That is the miracle. How something so complex remained so grounded. How the African roots never loosened, even as branches stretched across oceans. Modern genetics didn't just confirm this story. It gave it detail, date, direction. Scientists traced the admixture event to around 1000 CE. Aligning precisely with archaeological shifts, the rise of Islamic coastal cities, and a sudden bloom in coral architecture. What the ground once suggested, the DNA now verifies. But science could only see what the people already knew. Because for centuries, the Swahili people kept their truth alive, not in textbooks, but in rituals, in names, in stories told by firelight. They remembered what the world tried to forget, that greatness was born not from purity, but from union. And in the blood of Tanzania's people today, that greatness still pulses. Not as a relic, as a rhythm. There are places on this earth where the soil feels older than time, and Tanzania is one of them. But here, history doesn't just linger in ruins or relics. It lives inside the people. Every heartbeat along this coast carries the rhythm of 1,000 years. Not as an echo of the past, but as its living continuation. Because when you walk the alleys of Bagamoyo or hear the call to prayer drift through the spice markets of Zanzibar, you're not just witnessing culture. You're standing in the aftermath of choices made by countless ancestors, some born here, others who crossed oceans with salt on their lips and stories in their veins. This land didn't absorb the world. It redefined it. It took elements from faraway empires and bent them into local meaning. It turned foreign arrival into familial legacy. And that transformation wasn't theoretical. It was genetic. The latest research doesn't just map out what happened. It forces us to rethink how civilizations evolve, not in isolation, not in purity, but through openness, guided by women who rooted identity, and by men who crossed borders, not just for trade, but for connection. What we see in Tanzanian DNA is a kind of quiet revolution, one that unfolded not with war drums, but with weddings, not with monuments, but with memory passed from generation to generation. And while many parts of the world try to forget their mixed pasts, Tanzania wears it like a crown, not as conflict, but as continuity. This isn't just a chapter in African history. This is a lens through which the entire human story can be re-examined. Because if one coastline, over 1,000 years, can hold within it Persia, India, Arabia, and sub-Saharan Africa, and still emerge as something distinctly, beautifully Tanzanian, then perhaps we've been asking the wrong questions about identity all along. Maybe identity isn't about drawing lines. Maybe it's about recognizing how often they've already been crossed, and what grew in the crossing.